This is a short video to explain the basics of feudalism in medieval Europe. Feudalism was a political and economic system during the Middle Ages from around the 8th century to the 15th century AD, so it was a system that lasted for many hundreds of years. Feudalism involved 4 levels of society. The king was at the top as he was the leader of the entire kingdom. Beneath him were the feudal lords, also known as nobles or barons, and these were the wealthiest landowners. Following the lords were knights or vassals, and their role was of the fighting warrior, who usually battled on horseback. Finally, on the bottom of society were the peasants or serfs. Peasants were farmers who worked the land, tending to crops and animals. They were the poorest members of the medieval world, but made up the biggest majority of the population. In these 4 social levels, feudalism worked through an exchange of land for protection, money, or food. Let's have a look at this in more detail. In the early Middle Ages, Europe was very unstable due to wars and invasions. The kings were quite weak and struggled to rule their entire kingdom by themselves. The system of feudalism arose as a matter of security for these European kings who decided it would be best to divide their land up so that they did not have to look after such a large area alone. If they strengthened their kingdom, it would then be harder for foreign people to invade. In the feudal system, the king would keep a share of the land for himself. This would be used for his palace and hunting forest, for example. The rest of the kingdom was then divided between noblemen who had been loyal to the king. The size of the land they received would depend on their personal ties with the king and the status of their family. Those lords would then keep some of the land for themselves and divide the rest up between knights of their choosing. In turn, the knights would give some of their portion of the kingdom to peasants who became serfs who were tied to the land and were not free to leave. Of course, these kings, nobles and knights were not giving away their land for no reason. As I said earlier, feudalism was based on an exchange of land for protection, money, and food. Looking at this flowchart, you can see on the right-hand side the granting of land to people of a lower social status, as I've just explained. But on the left-hand side, you can see what is being exchanged for this giving of land. On the very bottom of society, the peasants would work growing food and tending to animals. They were the backbone of society, as all the food they grew was not just for themselves and their families, it would actually feed the entire kingdom. So the knights would give land to peasants, so that they had farming area to grow this food, and in return the knights would protect the peasants. This was the exchange of land for labour. Next up on the scale, we can see that knights were given land by the nobles on the condition that the knights would be loyal to the lords and fight in battles when needed. This again was an exchange of land for labour. On the top of the scale, the nobles were given land by the king so that they would provide these knights to the king. The role of the nobles was to build up an army, be loyal and give money to the king, and this is what they had to do in exchange for their land. So the feudal system was quite beneficial to the king at the top. All he had to do was share some of his land, and in return he would receive food, military protection, money, and knights. This strengthened the kingdom and allowed him to remain in power. To summarise what we have learnt, Europe in the early Middle Ages was weak and under threat from foreign invasion. Kings needed to share their lands among their people to lessen their responsibility, and so the feudal system was established. The order of society was the king at the top, then the nobility, followed by the knights, then the peasants on the bottom. The system was based on an exchange of land for money, loyalty, protection, and food. This helped to secure Europe.